Thank you, everybody, for attending our digital keywords session as part of the DISCO Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism Network, which has been generously funded by the Mellon Foundation. And thank you for being here. We are going to get some excellent talks and conversation with 4 of our postdoctoral fellows, part of the DISCO network: Kevin Winstead, Rianna Walcott, Jeff Nagy, and Huan He. First, before we start, I wanted to go through some guidelines for today's event. If you have any access or technology related concerns or questions, please chat Eric Mancini, who will be monitoring the chat during this event. If you have any questions you'd like to ask the panelists, please put them in the chat and we'll turn to those as time allows. And please respect the privacy of our panelists and do not record or live tweet the event. We appreciate that very much. This is a closed session. A little bit about the DISCO network. My name is Lisa Nakamura. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and I am the PI of one of many PIs for our network, which integrates critical humanistic, social science, and artistic approaches to digital studies, foregrounding questions about technology, focusing on cultural implications of a new anti-racist and anti-ableist digital future. We are a network of labs who have come together to write together, to think together, and to create together around the future of racism, disability, racism, disability, and justice in the digital world. We also invite you to some of the events that individual labs are hosting. Coming up from the HAT Lab, the Humanities and Lab, PI'd by Rayvon Boucher, Transforming Video Games, Speedrunning, Trans Desire, and Embodied Glitches with Dr. Madison Schmalzer, November 22nd, 4 to 5:30 EST, which is going to be an online event as well. On December 1, we have an event called Platform Feminism and the Politics of Elevation with Dr. Rianna Singh. That is also 4 to 5:30. Please follow our link to see any other events that we have. If you would like to be a member, if this is your vibe, please write to us on the disco.org link, become a member, part asking to receive the newsletter. You'll be invited to our public events, such as our Summer Institute, learn about opportunities to do collective research, to work together. We would love to meet you. Maybe you would love to meet us. And if you want to become an affiliate, you have the opportunity and the welcome to be more deeply involved, either as an institution or as an individual. As an organization, we're here to get more open all the time. And here are our individual speakers. Dr. Rianna Walcott is the fellow for the BCAT Lab, PI'd by Catherine Knight Steele. She is a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland. Her PhD research focuses on Black British identity presentation in social media spaces. By taking a mixed method approach to investigating Black British social media usage, Rianna incorporates interviews and discourse analysis across various sites in order to examine digital communities, the circumstances under which they are created, and the constraints they face. This research investigates if and how discourse varies in different contexts with different demographics, and how social network services and their attendant harms impact how Black users express themselves. This is going to be wonderful. After Rianna, we will hear from Jeff Nagy, who is the Michigan Hub Network Fellow working on building out the network. He is a member as well of the Digital Accessible Futures Lab. He holds a PhD in communication from Stanford University, and his research uncovers deep genealogies for digital technologies and shows how these histories continue to shape our social and political worlds. His recent writing has appeared in Communication, Culture and Critique, Technology and Culture, New Media and Society, and elsewhere. His current book project, Computing with Feeling, Emotional Data from Cybernetics to Social Media, tells a story of how emotion was made computable. Awesome. Then we'll hear from Huan He, who is a Michigan Hub Curriculum Development Fellow. He holds a PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California. His research engages Asian American literature and culture, histories of media and technology, visual culture, digital game studies, and poetics. His book project, currently entitled The Racial Interface, explores the racial associations linking Asian Americans and information technology in the digital era. Drawing from literature, art, and archival sources, this project reveals how myths of racial and technological progress converge in the shadow of US liberal capitalism. He foregrounds minoritarian writers and artists who challenge the dominant technological imaginaries shaping the digital present. He's also interested in the relationship between race, gaming, cheating, and scams, and pursuing a second project on these topics. His scholarly writing has been published in College Literature, a journal of critical literary studies, and Media and his forthcoming anthology on Asian American game studies. In fall 2022, he will start as an assistant professor of English, Asian American, and Asian diasporic literature at Vanderbilt University. Lastly, we have Kevin Winstead, the Preach Lab Fellow, the project on rhetorics of equity, access, computation, humanities within the School of Literature, Media, and American Studies, and Communication at Georgia Tech, PI'd by Andre Brock. He earned his PhD in American Studies at the University of Maryland, and his research focuses on Black social movements and online transglobal disinformation. He is currently working on his forthcoming manuscript, Sankofa Cyberculture, Black Digital Activism, and Disinformation. Thank you so much for coming. Please stay in touch, and I will hand it over to our first presenter.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Rianna. Let me do the thing. Okay, so my talk is using the keyword ritual, and I've taken some of what I will be saying today from my very recently completed PhD dissertation. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to get in touch with me afterwards. My emails are walcott@umd.edu, and I'm at the BCAT lab. So yeah, I hope to publish on this further down the line, you know, when the time comes to start shopping out the manuscript and all that. Okay, so the way that I put this together is I started thinking about performance rituals on social media and the way that, particularly focusing on Black communities, and in my case for this work, Black British communities as part of a broader Black diaspora online, and thinking through social media as a living archive. And by that, I turn to Stuart Hall's articulation of the living archive in explanation of what is at stake for those Black users and co-curators. Hall notes that this archive defies the notion of completeness, but instead is a continuous production informed by practitioners who are themselves active participants in defining the archive. They may have contributed to it, they may have collected some of it, they have appreciated and helped to interpret it. So similarly, through Black Twitter and other like Black social media communities and their archival practices, the Black archive is jointly gatekept by its co-constituents. So in the case of Black Twitter, as I'll use today, the deployment of that searchable ephemera that's maintained via quote tweets, bookmarks, screenshots, turns all Black Twitter users into co-curators. And while searchable, archivable ephemera may seem oxymoronic, I would argue that this seeming contradiction is key to Black Twitter's ritual. So through this maintenance of the living archive and the participation in the curation of that archive that becomes a ritual performance of community, this collection is created by active participants who contribute to, and most importantly, reinterpret its materials by co-constituting shared maps of meaning. So this active participation in the digital living archive then codifies membership to a Black public as the content is communally remembered, contributed to, and reinterpreted. Shared references become play events in a way that co-constructs those maps of meaning that Hall references and creates multi-layered hyper-narrative webs of context for the participants. Today, I'm really briefly, because of time constraints, going to touch on just a couple types of rituals. These are formed in both inter or intra community performances. So it would be the difference between Black communities speaking outwards to non-Black communities, or the different sections of Twitter that like assemble themselves or are known as different spaces, is speaking in-house and keeping that kind of conversation and performance in-house. And two of the examples that I use here would be dragging and what we affectionately refer to as hypergeticals. So this here is an excerpt from some of the interviews that I did, and I'll just read it out loud. So Jess, some of my friends are very good at going back on Twitter and finding old tweets. You know who. People do take screenshots of tweets and stuff, but I'm not really on board with that. And then I responded, the memory on Twitter is very long, but some of us just participate by watching, and some of us actually there are the holders, the librarians, and then the librarians versus the readers. And Jess then helpfully reframes those readers as the nosy Negroes. So in interview, as well as the discourse samples that I collected from different social media platforms, multiple of my participants were very aware of and made explicit reference to the archive and the way that they use Black social network sites as archives. They were seen as more than just personal memory, but also as the physical infrastructures that are available on digital media. This cognizance of the Black archive as being multiply cited speaks to the work of Jenny Sharp on the immaterial archive, by which she means the expanded understanding of what constitutes the archive in a movement from official records as the primary source to embodied memory forms, oral histories, and digitization. And of course, that's particularly relevant when you're speaking about marginalized communities who may not have the requisite access to brick and mortar archives and institutions. Okay, so I think this is a perfect example of an archival ritual. Andre Brox actually explicitly said in this tweet, so this year from the Black Twitter Special Crimes Unit Archival Division. And I think that this you as an example of the way that people go back through social medias, or like a meta narrative, like assemble a meta narrative of what has happened on a media space's history, is a really good way of how we archive ephemera for use in ritual purposes. So thinking about receipts culture, where receipts are digital artifacts that are records of Twitter users' signals and are often used in intra and inter-community conversations about accountability. So in this tweet, Brock references this practice as an archival act. The receipts culture, or this you, refers to the propensity of Black users to intervene with receipts from a user's past transgression, usually at a critically timely moment when their current presentation of self collides with a behavior from their past. In order to frame the form and function of these rituals, I used theory on the community functions of gossip. When exploring this literature, I found overlapping understandings of gossip that shares features with other terms such as bitching, dragging, calling in, or calling out. Going forward, I'm going to use dragging to define this community ritual for 4 reasons. Firstly, dragging was the term that was most commonly used by my interlocutors in interview to describe their behavior. And it also best encompasses the multivalent applications of the form, from malicious gossip to a more harmless form of gossip that involves news giving, to social critique, where dragging lacks the gendered connotations of bitching and gossip as well, which allows for the wider application of the term to all of the Black participants. And finally, dragging carries with it the historical and Black feminist practice of critiquing transgression as an Indigenous Black expressive form. Common to the literature on dragging as a discursive form is the framing of the act as narrative, a participatory and co-constructed act of affirming solidarity through shared values and agreed ways of seeing the world, where unjust behaviors are collectively discussed, morally evaluated, and prescribed a remedy through the collective reasoning of culturally aligned online crowds. Meredith Clark relates this practice to historical acts of Black feminized labor, and signifying, withering critiques that are not wrapped up in niceties and polite speech, as the urgency and weight of oppression require us to immediately cry out. In sum, dragging has a function for Black users. It cannot be reduced to just a simple pettiness. Dragging is just as often a method of venting about the impacts of hegemonic cultural values and providing viable alternatives to systemic inequalities. So here I refer to the hypergetical as ritual. From this tweet on the left, we've got an absolutely classic hypergetical. If a man is dating a woman with kids, is he wrong for going to her house with dinner for two? Or is he obligated to feed her kids as well? And the person has quote tweeted this by saying, now we are getting back to what this app is truly about, hypergeticals. And I would say that perhaps the easiest way to distinguish the Black British Twitter community is by participating in or viewing one of the community discursive rituals, these hypergeticals, that are regular cyclical conversations and topics that these rituals orient themselves around. Masanari writes of the ritual of play as a performance occurring on message forum sites such as Reddit that act as a way of enacting culture and thus reaffirming membership to the community. These shared living archives function as, firstly, subjects for these discursive rituals, as events, artifacts, and previous discourse are signified on to create new meanings, and two, as an externalization of Black memory, both of online and offline events, as Black Twitter users continually add to and remix content from the archive to develop what we'll call those shared cultural maps and histories. In keeping with thinking of a Black archive as immaterial, fluctuating, ephemeral, the process of archival co-construction, retrieval, and remix is a continuous set of overlapping actions. To remix and signify on the archive is to retrieve objects from its depths, and simultaneously to be part of its construction through the addition of remixed new productions. And what I've got here on the right is a tweet from just a week ago that really responds to this crucial moment that we're in with Twitter at the moment, where we're thinking about the future as a platform and the future of those communities who have made a home of it and are performing these different types of rituals. So the original tweet here says, for old time's sake, before we leave Twitter, if you're in the car with your husband and he picks up his mama, do you get in the back seat? Which is a throwback to a very old and regularly recurring conversation and question about dating practices in the Black community. And as a response to it, we see some more evidence of that sort of remixing, where they've taken something that is ostensibly very different as a response. Easy, I feed my man first because we have a gay thought non-binary child, and then, but who would you save in that house fire? If you weren't familiar with the ritual that's being performed here, if you weren't familiar with the long sort of webs that have taken us to this point, where this is a language, a discourse that makes sense to those participating in it, that would mean nothing to you. But because it is part, like, as a result of remixing so many of these questions that have come before, we have entirely new productions that are able to be tacked on and amended and become part of the archive and part of the ritual play. And then finally, because I know I'm getting close to over the time here, I've just to think about, again, another tweet that came, a wonderful thread that I recommend checking out if you haven't already. This Black Twitter quiz that this user has put up really speaks to the function of Twitter as a meta-narrative, and the way that Lockett writes of Black Twitter as a living archive of collective memories of Blackness. As the process of remixing and signifying is participatory and reliant on a communal memory, Twitter users construct and are conversant with a narrative timeline of its history. This meta-narrative is in itself an archive, a recursive conversation with itself. The Black digital archive becomes an externalized form of collective memory built by ritual acts of communication that harden into a cultural memory over time. And here we have some examples of a lot of different very pivotal, crucial events across Black Twitter's history that have been reformed into one. Like and it's a really interesting time because people are sort of spontaneously constructing all of these meta narratives and retrospectives on Black Twitter's history that I think is part of like a ritual grieving process, even like a community way of understanding ourselves in this space and where we go next. Okay, that's it from me, but here's the slide with all of my references. And I know that the PowerPoint's been popped in the chat, so do feel free to come back to these references later if you're interested in following up on any of that. Thank you.
Hi, so I think I'll take it from there. Give me just a second to share my slides. And thank you, Rianna, for that fascinating talk. I already have some questions for you. Okay, I think you should be seeing my slides now and not my notes, which is exactly what I want. So yeah, thank you all of you who've showed up today for this event. My name is Jeff Nagy, and as Lisa said, I'm the Disco Hub Network Building Fellow. And I'm a historian of computing and artificial intelligence, which if you don't really know anything about my work, and I don't expect most of the people in the audience here do, it might make it seem a bit odd that I've selected emotion as my keyword. And I'm going to get to that. If I can advance my slide, I will get to that, I promise. Here we go. So when I was thinking about what I was going to say at this event, I was looking back at Raymond Williams' Keywords, which was first published now almost half a century ago. He called keywords an inquiry into vocabulary. And the terms that he chose to investigate were key in the sense that they were kind of like a handle on entire ways of thought and life. They served as sort of shibboleths for whole historical formations of culture and society. In 2016, Ben Peters' Digital Keywords updated Williams for a digital age, tying the appearance and disappearance of keywords to media history, where they point to the gelling of, quote, discursive power across the state, civil society, law, religion, economics, culture, technology, and the natural world, which is to say, reality. Now, there are a lot of things in Peters' list, as there should be if they add up to reality itself, but emotion doesn't appear among that book's digital keywords. And it wasn't in Williams' critical vocabulary either. In 1978, emotion appeared in the text only as the opposite or the undertow of scientific rationalism. And we're kind of used to thinking of it this way as the dark side of information, the mid-century concept that gave the age we all live in its name. But what I want to show you is why we need emotion as a digital keyword and why we need it now. So Williams had already sort of given us a clue. If he didn't include it in 1978, he did talk about it in 1977's Marxism and Literature. I know it's like real throwback here. I'll get closer to the present, I promise. But in 1977, Williams had written about what he called structures of feeling, which he used to indicate precisely what couldn't be made into a keyword, a kind of embryonic affect that sat in the tension between life and the concepts we use to talk about it. Quote, an unease, a stress, a displacement, a latency. They were what he called social experiences in solution before they crystallized into something visible and nameable. What we have now, today, instead of structures of feeling, are infrastructures of feeling, to use Elizabeth Elsesser's phrase. And this is basically the crux of my research. We're used to thinking about digital technologies in terms of information, petabytes of data flowing this way and that from our phones and laptops and watches to networks around the globe and back. But the devices and platforms we use in our everyday lives also play host of systems that encourage and measure and police and monetize our feelings and how we give them voice. Social media platforms, as we just saw a bit of in Rianna's presentation, for instance, are not just vectors for information, they also function as aqueducts for emotion belonging among them. They enable a large-scale and lucrative logistics of feeling and coordinate what Zizi Papakurisi called effective publics. Empathic AI systems, like the one you see on screen, a platform called Afdex, claim to transform human emotion into machine-readable and machine-manipulatable data, relying on what they tout as the world's largest emotion database. These systems are increasingly ubiquitous. They're baked into digital platforms and wearables and internet infrastructure. And they're used for everything from pinpointing when users might be most vulnerable to a product placement, to monitoring drivers for road rage, to tone policing call center employees. Now, what my research shows as a historian is that this world of empathic machines and effective platforms was a long time coming. It didn't just emerge kind of out of the ether in the past 20 years, sometimes as pundits like to think, pointing at things like big data and social media. In fact, my book project, Computing with Feeling, shows how this new kind of algorithmic power came to be, how it was pursued from the very beginnings of the digital age, although often by unusual people in unusual places, like this man you see here on screen on your left. His name is Manfred Kleins. He was a research scientist at a large state psychiatric hospital outside of New York City, and he worked in the 1960s and 1970s to develop data signatures for emotion, which you can see here on the right. These histories matter for how digital emotion works today. For instance, the foundation of many contemporary emotion AI systems that work with facial emotion is Paul Ekman's 50-year-old schema of 6 basic emotions. You can see these here on the left: surprise, anger, happiness, fear, sadness, and disgust. Anger, disgust, sorry, is a bit of a red herring. That's a hybrid that is not one of the basic emotions. Now, these systems carry around what we might call, following Rob Kitchen, data ontologies, sort of implicit theories of what emotions are and how many there are of them and what they look like and who gets to have them. For instance, here, the data ontology might be that they're limited in number, they're universal, and they're displayed in the face by everyone in the same way through the unconscious micro movements of facial muscles. But the nature of emotions and who gets to have them are, of course, political questions. And so these ontologies reflect larger systems of knowledge and power, which as they get baked into emotion AI, they naturalize and obscure. So then it might not surprise you to hear that these systems are ridden with algorithmic bias. Lauren Rue, for instance, has shown how they often ascribe more negative emotions to Black faces, reading them as angry or contemptuous more frequently than the white faces that make up the bulk of their trading data and that provide the implicit ground for their data ontologies. It's not for nothing that Ekman validated his metrics in neocolonial experiments with the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea, which he referred to, and which sort of amazingly his website still refers to as, quote, Stone Age people. The construction of these systems, and this is not like an isolated dynamic, like the systems as they're constructed often mobilize marginalized groups who are sort of framed as being emotionally exemplary or pathologized as emotionally deficient. For instance, the platform I mentioned a few slides ago, Aftex, was conceptualized through an ableist model of autism that characterizes it as a disorder of empathy. The image on screen here is from Microsoft's facial recognition platform, Azure. Just this past summer, Microsoft pulled its emotion recognition tools from the platform over heightened privacy concerns and because of longstanding issues with bias. But if Azure represents one step back for digital emotion, everywhere else is 2 steps forward. Here, for instance, is a patent filed earlier this year for a system that would enable users to monitor and police their own moods, discouraging frustration and contempt, and prompting what they call, quote, happy browsing, which side benefit of this kind of delightfully named happy browsing is that it would automate the liking of your friend's social media posts as if, smashing that like button was sometimes just too much trouble. And here's a second example, is a patent that Amazon filed in 2018. This is an Alexa-based system that would monitor users' voices for signs of emotional distress, and then would intervene with a product or content recommendation tweaked to take advantage of fluctuations in users' moods. So what these examples show is that we already live in a world where, more likely than not, your smart speaker is trying to guess if you're feeling insecure in order to push you ads, and your Fitbit might diagnose or misdiagnose your depression. And that's why if emotion was below the radar of digital keywords in 2016, I think it couldn't be more crucial now. And with that, I'll just say thank you.
All right, hi everyone. I'm just gonna share my slides. Okay, can everyone see my slides? Okay, thank you. All right, well, it's great to be here and in conversation with the other postdocs. Thanks, Jeff and Rianna, for those lovely talks. The digital keyword I'll be presenting on today is myth, which is basically kind of an entryway into talking about my research in general and thinking about the racial histories of the digital. So I'm going to spend today talking a little bit about the book project that I'm working on and sharing kind of a sample and sketch of some of the ideas that I'm working through. So most broadly, I am a literary and cultural studies scholar who focuses on Asian American literature and art, as well as digital studies. Particularly, I'm interested in how racial narratives of foreignness, labor, migration, and assimilation have shaped the emergence of information capitalism and the digital present. Myths are important to my thinking because they are pervasive in digital culture and play an important part in shaping normative and dominant imaginaries of digital technologies. And at the same time, myths powerfully construct racial meaning in the era of liberal capitalism. So in the context of Asian American racialization, I think one of the strongest examples is, for example, the model minority myth, a racial ideology that emerged in the 1960s as a form and logic of social control against Black and Brown populations, civil rights movements, and decolonization movements in the US and across the globe. By transforming Asian Americans from, quote, yellow peril foreigners only decades prior to celebrated model minorities, this racial myth, I argue in my work, is also computational in the sense that the model minority ideology renders race to be user-friendly. In other words, by casting race as user-friendly, the model minority myth promotes ideas of individual empowerment, labor efficiency, and representation at the expense of deeper structural and relational accounts of race. And throughout my research, rather than simply debunking myths, I'm interested in tracking their social power. And if we hold them close under critical scrutiny, we can better understand how racial and technological myths, ultimately racial and technological meaning and power, overlap and are mutually reinforcing. So to elaborate why I'm interested in myth, I just want to go through kind of a quick example from the realm of tech culture. The wealthy and successful Asian American internet entrepreneur Jerry Yang, a software engineer and billionaire co-founder of Yahoo in the dot-com boom of the 1990s. Here's a kind of unflattering picture of him on this slide. Born in Taiwan and raised in San Jose, California, Yang is a so-called Asian American success story, an example of the model minority through his adventures in Silicon Valley. He later became a venture capitalist and funded many startups, including Zoom, the platform that's connecting us this very moment. And as a highly visible embodiment of the possibilities afforded by startup innovation, Yang is often cited not only as an example of the Silicon Valley dream, but also of the American immigrant dream. Appearing in many public-facing venues as a face of Asian American achievement, Yang often narrates his personal success story through the historical metaphor of the railroad. In the PBS documentary miniseries Asian Americans, released in 2020, Yang describes his experience in the competitive tech startup environment as, quote, laying down the train tracks, end quote. To keep up with the fast-growing pace of innovation, he tells the viewer that, quote, as the train is running, you just got to stay ahead of it, end quote. Comparing his life to that of the railroad worker, he recounts his own pioneering status in 1990 Silicon Valley by invoking the railroad as a mediating device. Yang's reference of a railroad worker imbues, I suggest, a racial quality to his description of Silicon Valley. His metaphor invokes the abstraction of ethnic identity to connect his elite position as a Chinese tech entrepreneur with the manual labor of disenfranchised Chinese railroad workers in the late 19th century, whose bodies were racialized as machinic, expendable, and inhuman. In the racist words of California Senator John Miller in 1881, Chinese coolie laborers were perceived to be, quote, machine-like, of obtuse nerve, but little affected by heat or cold, wiry, sinewy, with muscles of iron. They are automatic engines of flesh and blood, end quote. Not only were Chinese railroad laborers dehumanized, but they were specifically racialized in technological terms, a hyper-scrutiny of the mechanized body that are noticeably absent from the abstract immaterial fantasies of Yang's cyberspace era. Thus, Yang's railroad metaphor attempts to smooth over incommensurate relations between Asian subjects and technology, at times figured as the exploited subject, such as the Chinese coolie machine, and other times as the beneficiaries of technological modernity, such as the elite Chinese American tech entrepreneur. For Yang, the railroad concretizes both a so-called Silicon Valley success story and an Asian American success story. And on two seemingly different registers, the past is revived to reinforce a narrative of development. Yet my research contends that these two registers, one racial and one technological, are not distinct, but rather intertwined. That is, Yang's railroad metaphor demonstrates how myths of racial and technological progress are conjoined and mutually reinforcing in the era of information capitalism. So having worked in the tech startup world prior to academia, I've always been fascinated by someone like Jerry Yang. And this is not to valorize an elite figure like him, but to critically recognize that Yang represents a significant portion of contemporary Asian America that intersects with tech culture and technology more broadly. And this is something that I also see in ethnic studies classes that I've taught in terms of many students of Asian descent who want to enter tech and computer science. As a literary and cultural studies scholar, I've been driven to understand this comparative link between the Asiatic and the technological. Why are Asian Americans closely associated with information technologies on the level of culture, form, and representation? So this is kind of, the central question that's animating the book project that's basically I'm working on as a revision of my dissertation. The book asserts that the story of how Asians in America became racialized as model citizens converges with the story of how computers became a model technology. Examining literature, art, and historical sources, the racial interface, the current title of the book, interprets the dominant history of information technologies as an assimilation narrative, bolstered by Asian American racial discourse. Through the work of artists such as Isamu Noguchi, Namjoon Paik, Irie Lee, Janice Lobo-Sapigao, Franny Choi, Tishan Xu, and others, I'm interested in how the expressive arts can reveal and critique these converging myths of racial and technological progress, born out of American capitalist values and settler colonial ideology. Ultimately, the book argues that Asian American literature and art present a critical genealogy of information capitalism. I'll end my brief talk with just a quick meditation on Zealand's piece titled Chinaman's Chance on Promontory Summit. I won't have time to kind of go into a close reading of the work, but on the left of this slide is a still from his time-based artwork, which remediates a famous image on the right of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Golden Spike Ceremony at Promontory Summit, Utah, which was photographed originally by Andrew Russell, in which Leland Stanford, a railroad tycoon, was kind of this keynote figure for that ceremony. Through a critical reinterpretation of historical framing, Lin's artwork unearths the racial mythologies that shape and connect industrial capitalism and information capitalism. And more so, we might consider his work as perhaps a counter-aesthetic to Jerry Yang's railroad metaphor. That is, if Yang's railroad metaphor exemplifies Silicon Valley's forward-moving notions of development and progress, promoting the ethos of, quote, staying ahead of the train tracks, end quote, then Lin's art orients us to the perspective from behind the tracks. Many scholars have pointed out that the original Russell photograph on the right tells a story of white industrial expansion and leaves out Chinese workers and indigenous peoples in the making of the railroad. Yet Lin's artwork does not default to a logic of inclusion and representation and does not desire to insert Asian and indigenous peoples in history. Rather, it shifts the perspective in which tech history is imagined. This view foregrounds the plains and land not as the photographic background or passive setting, but rather as the central subject of technology history, shifting the historical concerns to questions of land, exclusion, and invisible labor that make up the backdrop of these histories. What histories of the digital are made possible in this inverted view? What critical reorientations might we seek that distort myths of technological development and progress? And I'll end there. Thank you.
I'm gonna take that as a sign that I'm next up here. Hello everyone, let me share my screen. Okay, I guess I have to ask the same question. Can everybody see my slides and not my notes? Great, awesome. Okay, so my keyword was disinformation. I've been exploring a lot on the differences between disinformation, misinformation, and manipulation. And I'm going to share a bit of my my full manuscript project with you all today to kind of explore this. So during the 2016 presidential election cycle, the United States saw an unprecedented propaganda assault on the American political consciousness by its adversaries made successful through global network social media systems. What was particularly interesting for me was Russia's ability to permeate American digital subcultures, including Black Twitter, challenging a commonly held position of subculture policing practices. Black Twitter is a social subpublic on the platform, mediated through Black cultural discourse or signifying practices. The field on disinformation has yet to address how Russian intelligence was able to successfully influence subcultures such as Black Twitter and contribute to Twitter's Black political discourse. As a result of the lack of attention and the lack of analysis on this phenomenon, it increases the likelihood of future international interference in political mobilization among Black Americans. And it's something that we're particularly sensitive in as we continue to go through these election cycles. So in what follows, I applied an adaptation of critical technocultural discourse analysis to explore Russia's attempt to digitally infiltrate Black online communities through mimicking Black Twitter's visual culture practices. Specifically, I asked the following questions. How significant was one of the Russia's fake accounts, Crystal Johnson's engagement with Black Twitter? What was the nature and structure of this fake account's engagement? What allowed her to be effective? And how did the interface of Twitter contribute to Crystal's believability as an actual person online? I'm sure everyone here understands what Twitter is, and I want to just take us back a little bit to where Twitter was at that time in 2016. So it's as a platform, it is dwarfed in activity by the kind of consortium of Facebook owned platforms, but it's still a central hub for a lot of political discourse and interactions with media, and certainly at that time was continuing to grow as the source of information for political campaigns, both collecting information and also distributing that information. I really want to get into who Crystal Johnson was, right? So Crystal was part of a multi-account network of Russian propaganda. She also had a bit of a backstory that she served as a journalist for a fake Black news site called Black Matters US, which was a real blog site that was that used user-generated information to create blog posts, to create news. But it was absolutely owned and operated the Russian propaganda machinery. The Black Matters US had its own Twitter account, also had a YouTube account, and also was creating its own podcast, right? To tell you a bit of the significance of Black Matters US, they were able to successfully create 2 different rallies, one in New York a few days after President Trump's election, in which they were able to amass approximately about 7,000 people in Times Square, and also during kind of the height of what was happening in Cleveland, Black Matters US was actually successful to start a rally in Cleveland that at that time was Cleveland's largest rally known to date. So they were representing themselves as part of the Black Lives Matter network. They called these rallies into action, and people showed up and attended, but it had no affiliation with Black Lives Matter. In fact, these were essentially Russian-sponsored events. Want to get into a little bit of the engagement with Crystal. So Crystal was someone that I followed, right? Many academics across the spectrum followed. Certainly she was successful enough to be retweeted and quoted by celebrities, by Jack Dorsey himself, by other academics, and even news sources, right? So before the report came out on what accounts were fake or not, Crystal was by far one of the most successful accounts in engaging both inside of Black community, but also kind of in national networks. But it's not to say that no one was suspicious of Russia's influence in our campaigns and just our regular discourse. There was a of Black women who created the hashtag Your Slip is Showing, both Hudson and Crockett, that was very much vigilant of disinformation, misinformation that was created more domestically, right? And were some of the first people to also notice that some phenomenon was happening both and within the international context, but they were not given nearly the attention or resources to be able to explore their own kind of personal independent research in this way. To talk a little bit about what the types of content that Crystal Johnson produced that lends itself to how effective she was, the large majority of Crystal's tweets were using visual culture, right? Using a lot of videos and images. And again, much like the blog site, was using stuff that other people had already produced, right? And it's why I'm having a trouble with the concepts between disinformation, misinformation, or is this more just kind of a sentiment manipulation? Because those images are real, the videos are real, the messaging that was around a lot of her content was absolutely real. But instead of it being something that was a falsity being distributed to the masses, it was more of what emotions were being pulled and drawn out, and if that would have happened on its own organically is really what I'm trying to tease out in this project. Again, this just shows that a lot of her own tweets were oftentimes original tweets. Original being that there was not a retweet, or at the very least, if it was a quote tweet, that she added her own information on top of that tweet, right? And we'll show a little bit of examples. So a lot of her tweets, we tried to categorize through some general themes. A lot of her tweets were focused on the mundane, the everyday, right? Not necessarily even politically charged or motivated. It was just things that people say every day to kind of blend into community, right? So in this tweet, she has multiple pictures of Michelle Obama, and she's talking about, as many do and still do, will continue to do, celebrate the intelligence of Michelle Obama as a independent intellectual separate from her husband, right? But she also absolutely, Crystal, stole people's tweets, right? In this case, she stole Tyree Boyd Pate's tweets, which was about 20, had the impact of about, let's see, had about a 10,000 impact at that particular time. But when Crystal just stole this man's tweets and posted it on her own platform, she was able to get a greater range of impact and was able to get about 26,000 impressions within the first day or so, right? It's an interesting comparison between these two accounts. So Tyree is a fairly well-known person within Black Twitter spaces. Certainly was one of the earlier adopters of Twitter's old blue check system before Elon came and just messed all of that up. So we're not talking about an insignificant account that she's able to double in traffic, right? So just is kind of to tell you the popularity of where Crystal is compared to the rest of the environment. Crystal, if as a real person in this time and day, probably would have been someone that would have been able to gain some of the social capitals that comes with having a blue check or being in that kind of mid-celebrity space, right? And she absolutely trafficked in kind of the tropes of pride that we had that would go into masking some of the reasons why we should be skeptical of an account like this, right? Again, the overwhelming majority of her tweets had nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. It was everything about making sure that she was believable as an account in this space, right? So in this example, she's absolutely playing up on the kind of Black Twitter campaign that was Black Girls Magic, coined in 2013 by Keshawn Thompson, that gets shortened down to Black Girl Magic. But while this term finds its way into film, television, and music, so does its reach, right? So there's this way that she's able to play on these tropes without necessarily saying anything that's too flamboyant that gives you a reason to have a cause to pause, right? What was really, really interesting for me through this process is after the reports came out and there was kind of physical evidence to show that Crystal was not human and certainly not part of this community, that Black people had much of a shock and mourning period, right? That people had bonded with her, retweeted her, engaged her. And it was through kind of this reclamation process that we kind of realized that there were moments that Crystal might have been operated by an actual human, in addition to moments where she was probably being operated by some sort of algorithm that was producing the content, right? There were moments where people had retweeted or liked something and engaged it in some way, and there was some sort of human call and response moments. But again, overwhelming majority of the stuff was visual stuff that wasn't much engagement with, but certainly you left room for your own interpretation and to produce your own types of emotion. But through that experience, though, many of the users within Black Twitter spaces became much more vigilant to thinking through what Russian propaganda looked like as it was being aimed at their own communities. After Crystal was identified as a Russian account and was removed off of Twitter, we started to see other accounts pop up that was performing that same action, where we started to pay a little bit more attention to the nature of their accounts. In some ways that I think, as we talk around identity and kind of making room for people at the margins can be a little bit problematic, but at the same time, as you're trying to vet people's accounts online, kind of makes sense to ask questions in this way. So the first example of this is Jamisha Shaz, right? Jamisha is a Russian account that was produced right after Crystal was taken down. She reads as a teacher, as an educator, very much part of kind of the Black intellectual community that's on Twitter. But people had an issue with the fact that she was from Cheyenne, Wyoming, right? Now, is that fair to say? I am not here to say that that's fair or unfair, but it absolutely was the reason why people started to question her. It was like, I don't know, it's not a lot of Black people in Cheyenne. I don't know if that's actually true. They went through a vetting process. It was like, oh yeah, actually no, Jamish, that's a fake account. That's absolutely a fake account, right? And even then, Jamisha started to already in this short amount of time was able to have influence, right? She was able to get the Weather Channel to engage her. She was able to get, again, credible users that we all know to engage with her as well, right? So this notion, even after the Congress's report on fake accounts came out, this notion that it was only happening in kind of mainstream discourse, predominantly aimed at white Americans, is just, it's not showing up that way in my evidence, and is much more nuanced. And I think if we do continue to look and explore how Russia's influence may have impacted subcultures, that we're going to see repeats of this. And I think we have seen evidence even in these midterm elections that there were attempts at influencing sentiment in subcultures. So I'm going to stop there because of time, and I would love to have more engagement.
Thank you. Those are amazing talks. There are 2 questions queued up in the Q&A box, which you can see. But first, I'd like to invite you to talk amongst yourselves among some of the connections you see between the work that you're doing, which is amazing. I see many, but first I'd like to open it up to you all.
Do we just jump in here? Is that how we do it?
Yes, jump
Okay.
in.
Well, Jeff, I'm really interested in thinking through emotion work in online space, right? I think that emotions is the thing that's complicating a lot of the conceptualizations I have around disinformation, misinformation, and this other thing that is happening here, right? They're trying to, in a lot of ways, I think, God, it's not even a fake emotion. If I was to put it on a scale and say that this phenomenon would have produced a people's upset level of a 5, but this account is pushing them to be more upset at a level of an 8, I don't know that that's necessarily dis or miss as it is just kind of emotional manipulation, right? So trying to square away where the scholarship is and what I'm seeing is continuously bringing me back to emotion work. So I'm really, really interested in you publishing all of the things so I can read it and putting it out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think this is something that people talked a lot about in the wake of the 2016 presidential election and the sort of efforts at psychographic targeting. Like, certainly the idea that you could use these surveys to capture personality characteristics that might include sort of mood structures and use those mood structures to antagonize people, to kind of create these sorts of like effective publics that are astroturfed but are from real people. Like, this is very interesting, right? Like, I still kind of can't wrap my head around this, that essentially like propaganda bots manage to get real people to go out and confront each other in real places. Like, there's not a Russian provocateur like flying to Tulsa, Oklahoma and putting on a cowboy hat and going out to the Walmart parking lot. Like, those people were there. They had some sort of base sentiment that could be activated, like lexically at a great distance, effectively enough that they left their homes and shouted at each other. So, like, the question of, I totally relate to the conceptual sort of confusion here. Like, what was activated were real beliefs in a way that they must have sort of previously held. Like, there was fertile ground for the misinformation to have the effect it did, to create this this kind of like puppet effective public. And I don't know. I mean, I think so. Maybe this relates to the thing that I was thinking of that bridges maybe between your talk and Rianna's talk about the way that participating in rituals, community rituals, gives you a kind of belonging and a kind of authenticity. Like, if you're seen as a responsible co-curator of a living archive and accepted, that's also at the same time what gives you the power to propagate messages that are kind of contrary to that public's interests. So I was sort of curious. I don't think I'd ever thought about ritual and disinformation or misinformation together before, but now that I've heard both of you speak, they seem to me to be deeply, deeply connected, like two sides of the same coin. So I'd love to hear both of you talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really striking me, like especially thinking about, blackfishing, as a sort of as a process, as something where, for various reasons, like that example was terrifying. The crystal example was really interesting to me because some of the groundwork that's required to sort of embody lexical patterns. You know, if I'm talking about ritual and thinking about the ways, though, you know, identity as a performance and as with like key markers and key moments in a group memory that people latch onto in order to demonstrate their belonging to a community. The idea that, you know, an outsider could do that with that kind of ease in order to do that. And I think, funnily enough, this actually ties into the question that I was asked in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and answer that if that's okay. This question from Victoria Chavez here about how I reconcile the meaning making and archiving my work is doing with giving the white gaze as a scholar in academia an insider look to communal Black Twitter routines. And, you know, after watching Kevin's talk and seeing the very real danger there of like being able to, you know, to embody and perform those rituals and those routines. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about the ethics of this kind of work. And I think I've got a bit of an answer, but I'm also very curious to hear about how you guys respond to possibly the ethical implications of making our work public in the way that we do with any type of digital inquiry. But one of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about and writing was with my ethical section, you know, thinking about a praxis of care and thinking about the ways that I cite, thinking about the things that I signal boost, thinking about the formats that I take work from in one space to another. And yeah, I mean, when it came to thinking about I must be honest, I do not center the white gaze in my work at all. I don't really think about it. It's not really any of my business. So, but I would say that one of the things that was most important to me in terms of my ethical practice is one, making sure that I get permit, like whenever I'm writing anything, I tend towards small scale qualitative analysis for this reason, because it's easier to do the kind of to take the ethical decisions that I make. But I'll actually go and ask people, like, are you happy with me reproducing this tweet? Are you happy with the way that I've written it? Are you happy with what I've written around it? You know, I go back and check with people that I reproduce the tweets of in written work. I didn't necessarily do that with this presentation with the ones that came from a few days ago, but they were all very viral tweets. But also, yeah, stuff like that, like a lot of it's interview processes are really vetting. But at the same time, you know, I've also taken some very deliberate decisions in the way that I write in terms of making sure that my work is community facing and also thinking about my outputs. Like I think it's really important for me that the work that I do is sort of by, for, about us and accessible to us. So, you know, if it means making sure that my outputs tend to, you know, are posted on the site that I got them from, that they are, you know, done in different formats, accessible formats like podcasts and so on. And also even just in like the nitty gritty of the way that I write. If it's not legible to my community, it's worthless. So like it's stuff like that that is very important to the way that I do this. As for the reproduction of this kind of work within an academic space, that's a tough one. It was especially difficult in a British context where there really are, when I tell you a lack of Black academics in the UK, like it really is, like you'd really be shocked. Like it's, and especially Black academics doing digital work like this, like Black digital work, there's 5 of us and I know them all. We all have each other's phone numbers, like it's that kind of level. So, you know, it did make that kind of thing difficult, but then at the same time, it did mean that there was this massive lack of, not interest, definitely not interest, because there was so much interest, there was so much excitement from all my participants to have their work represented in this way and to be sort of viewed as a legible community online. And it's interesting, it's funny, it's cool stuff. But yeah, like that was certainly something that I had to think about making that legible to white British institutional academia was, you know, a tricky decision. But it's just about, I think that there is an ethic of care that is required, and I do take notes from Patricia Hill Collins' Ethics of Care and Black feminist thought that guides the way that I do that guides my practice. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers it.
I had a question for Jeff. I was just absolutely fascinated by your talk, and I guess I was curious about within like the history of, you know, digitizing emotion, specifically like the kind of data signature of no emotion and affectlessness. I've been thinking a lot, like, I'm curious, like, in terms of that history, if you can speak more about that and whether or not that kind of lack of emotion also has particular registers for demarcating kind of who is classified as human or not. I've been thinking a lot about that because one of the chapters I've been returning to has been on, Asiatic inscrutability and specifically how the face becomes a marker. And also in general, I'm curious, like if the face is like the only kind of register, or like, I mean, it obviously is kind of the dominant register of like, thinking about emotion, but also like other non-facial kind of methods of gathering emotional data. But yeah, that really stuck out to me. I've been thinking a lot about kind of inscrutability and when something does not register, or in your case, kind of emotion.
Yeah, that's a great question. So facial emotion recognition is important, but there are obviously many other modalities that are used. So voice is certainly one of them. Like sentiment analysis using corpuses of text is very, very common. And even things like galvanic skin response, sort of measuring electric currents through the skin, is one that people use sometimes. The question of no emotion and like inscrutability is super, super interesting. I've thought about it in other connections, but maybe not in precisely the way you formed it. There's a scholar whose work I quite love named Oskies, who I believe is working on an article about Orientalism and emotion AI, where I think it's going to be right kind of along. I haven't seen the article yet, so I don't want to like predict what it's going to say because I literally don't know. They just like mentioned to me in an email, but I am waiting with bated breath, and I think it might be useful to you. Certainly, the question of like who gets to serve as emotionally representative is very important in this history and does connect to the histories of race and disability and gender as well. So I have an article that came out over the summer about the history of one emotion recognition platform called Aftex, which I talked a little bit about today, where pretty much like the entire history of the development of the system was premised on an ableist understanding of autism and of autistic people as being emotionally deficient, like incapable of properly recognizing and processing and communicating emotion. So they were kind of conceived of as falling into this inscrutable or no emotion category in order to motivate the production of emotional prostheses that were then, of course, later spun off for a commercial market where they now like serve you ads or keep you from getting mad while you're driving your smart car. So this is like kind of common. I mean, it goes even back to like the very beginnings of emotion science. Like some of the first attempts to systematically investigate emotional expression relied on experiments with a man who suffered from facial paralysis. So he was kind of permanently in the facial state of no emotion. This was like the end of the 19th century. But that meant that he could serve as emotionally exemplary because he felt no pain when his face was systematically stimulated with electrical current. So he could have his face basically shocked into expressions that the researcher thought were characteristic of emotion. Yeah, so I've blabbed a lot. I'll stop talking. That's a great, great question, one, and I'll keep thinking about it. We do have a,
Oh, go ahead.
oh no, I was just going to say we do have a couple other questions in the chat, I think.
Yeah, I see one that's directed towards me. I'll go ahead and take a stab at it here. So the question is if I could talk more about the increased circulation of feelings of suspicion and vigilance on Black Twitter following the revelation that Crystal and other prominent accounts were Russian bots, and have those feelings change the overall atmosphere of Black Twitter post 2016. So that's really interesting. That this is a conversation I've been having with my father as of late, because it circles back in some interesting ways with this whole Kanye and Kyrie phenomenon, right? That how can I explain this? I'll pose it the way my father asked me this question. How do I situate Black paranoia if it's rooted in some truths, right? And I was like, well, what do you mean about that? And it's like, well, my father is a former Panther and from Cleveland, and he was like, well, the state actors being against you is a real thing. Like, you do understand that, right? And it's like, well, okay, yeah, in these historical moments, sure, that's true. But do you mean like right now? And he's like, no, state actors have been against me my entire life, right? And then it was like, well, I want to say no to you, but actually I'm finding evidence like every day that like, oh yeah. No, he's absolutely true. He's absolutely right. So he was like, so am I paranoid or am I just right? It's like, well, that's an interesting kind of dynamic to think through, right? So I start from that position, but then also witnessing my father having conversations with his friends and his peer group, and how like off the deep end those conversations get kind of quickly on the conspiracy side. But it always starts with this nugget of truth that like is both soothing to them, but also keeps them on a constant state of edge, right? So to answer the question, was there any increased hysteria or kind of reluctance? No, because they already thought that they were always being surveilled at all times, and that's almost close to a universal truth of Black folks in online space, right? And interesting, actually, is a book that I want to suggest to folks who are interested in this. It's actually a book called FBI's by William J. Maxwell. He talks around J. Edgar Hoover creating basically a Black intelligentsia unit within the FBI from the Harlem Renaissance up and through the 70s. And their whole job was to make analysis of Black popular culture, Black literary culture, Black scholarly culture, right? To help inform the FBI on how to manipulate and use disinformation, and also this kind of emotional work back to that community. The FBI at that time had the first and the most elaborate Black Studies department in the country, right? The argument and the fear that I have is Russia has now created the first and the most elaborate Black digital studies, right, unit in the world, right? So we think about it in these kind of ways, and then we think around the utility of paranoia within subcultures. I don't know what to make of it yet. It's a lot of soup, but we're trying to get through it for sure.
I'm just seeing. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
Go ahead. I just wanted to add one thing. Hearing from Rianna that there are maybe 5 Black scholars in Britain studying this, but potentially thousands of Russians engaging in Black digital studies really gives me pause as someone who is helping to lead a grant that's about Black, person of color and disabled Black studies. So I think it's great that the Mellon Foundation is investing in this, along with the FBI and the Russians. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Jeff, for pointing to the questions. I just took the time to read the 2 that were directed at me, and I think these are absolutely great questions. I think the audience can see the questions, right? I don't have to. Okay. So yeah, Aaron's question, which is about the kind of ways in which there's always kind of this perilous for peril making and kind of peril panic that emerges along the lines of labor exploitation and modernity is a great point, especially when we think about, the kind of the early history of, Chinese yellow peril kind of commentary. But what's been really interesting to me, and this, some of what I talked about is part of a larger project that looks at the early kind of myth making and narratives, specifically the visual myth making practices that were part of the emerging Silicon Valley. And part of this chapter also engages Lisa's work on Fairchild Semiconductor and thinking about the kind of ways in which the kind of inclusion of racialized workers was not always in the language of peril, but in a kind of multicultural language of liberal celebration and inclusion. So that chapter, so I'm really interested in how these kind of how that shift happens, how the peril becomes kind of a model digital worker. What's interesting about kind of thinking about Fairchild Semiconductor is that so much of the archive, the visual archive of kind of who's working for Fairchild Semiconductor was made by, or the images and the photographs were taken by one of the world-renowned railroad photographers, Richard Steinheimer, who was kind of known as the Ansel Adams of railroad photography. And he kind of, completely transitioned from this kind of, artistic practice of photographing railroads to photographing people and kind of making sense of this industry in transition. And that type of, kind of, especially in these moments of transition when there's something new, it's interesting to me how kind of older narratives of, the railroad in the case of early Silicon Valley become used as a way to kind of situate tech work and the kind of making of microelectronics as a socially beneficial kind of industry. I was just looking at this chapter preparing for this talk, and John Heffler, who coined the term Silicon Valley, has this line where he talks about Silicon Valley as an extension of the Santa Fe Railroad and kind of uplifting workers of, he uses the phrase yellow and red tint. It's just like that type of myth making is, everywhere in the archive. And thinking about in terms of kind of the contemporary moment, for those of you, especially here in Michigan, I've been talking a lot about like blockchain. I've been thinking a lot about blockchain and race, and the kind of discourse of blockchain being kind of a new gold rush is, you see these kind of mythologies remediating kind of these new tech networks and infrastructures. So I think that kind of addresses, but the second one, which is, where I'm kind of pulling from this definition of myth, Roland Barthes' work on mythologies has always been really helpful for me, but just generally I'm interested in kind of the various multimedia dimensions of how we construct these ideologies that continue to, shape, especially, this kind of tech industries as it's transitioning. So yeah, so maybe I'll stop there.
We do have a couple minutes left, so if there are any other questions from the audience, I'm sure all of us would be delighted to talk a bit more.
So, I did have a question for, I guess, like kind of broad disco, that what are our intentions with doing these types of keywords, and like could this actually turn into like a keywords book, like because that would be kind of
Always on the mind of the publication.
Yeah, I mean, we got to eat out here too, you know what I mean?
I do not know, I think we're going to do another series of these, another event with this format. I think the date is TBD, but it'll be winter with the other 4 Disco Network fellows, so Lita Zeilen-Wu, David Edelman, Coleman Collins, and Aaron. I'm sorry, Aaron Dial. I have had a long day. So at that point, we'll have 8. I don't know how many keywords you need to make a book. I think we've all chosen pretty capacious ones. So maybe there's room to grow internally instead of having to fill out the index.
Yeah, I've just seen a question in the chat as well that's like about what the utility of keywords beyond our own research is. And I think I was just thinking that this has been like a really lovely exercise in distilling some parts of my work into just a single word. Like I hadn't necessarily, beyond going through the chapters of your dissertation and thinking about like what each one's talking to, like it was really lovely putting this together and thinking about like, well, what does ritual mean to me? And the fact that we've all chosen such varied but kind of overlapping content as well there. Like I think that there's been just something very valuable in being able to distill it to something like that, and then also define what you mean by that keyword in light of your own work. And in that way, it's, again, not to harp on about it, but like it's like a really like accessible entry point to some very complicated ideas and some very big, large bodies of work. I'm not 100% sure if that's like bookable, but it definitely seems like, you know, like a really lovely way to build in things like you know, perhaps we could be thinking about other formats for our work, like stuff like this, talks that circle around the same sorts of keywords, things that like easy publications that go out to, you know, out beyond the slow moving beast of journal publications and things like that. You know, it seems like a really nice entry point into work for people who possibly didn't know that they were coming here to talk about affect and inscrutability and Russian bots, you know?
Yeah, well,
we didn't coordinate this. We did not. There was no like cartel formed between us to choose these words. This was pure kismet. Sorry, Juan, I didn't mean to interrupt.
oh, no worries. I just wanted to add, I mean, alongside publishing, I think one of the other missions for Disco is kind of a student-oriented and teaching perspective. And I feel like all of the keywords, I can, you know, totally see like a whole kind of syllabus or set of units around these keywords. I love what you were talking about, that they're really entryways or portals into our own research, but I feel like all these keywords are really floaty in like a really productive way as well. So I'd be, you know, interested in how these keywords could be also teachable.
Rianna, your work has me thinking through how potentially a better way of understanding what's happening here is maybe the co-opting of ritual, right?
Yeah, like to what point identity can just be distilled down to that performance of ritual, and like, yeah.
Correct. In particular, because we know that sometimes in ritual that it's not necessarily interested in a truth, right? It's interested in your interpretation, right? So, you know, so much of the discourse around misinformation right now is what is a fact and who gets to determine what a fact is, right? That just does not situate itself well with like what happens within Black community, right? It's we are always taught a fact, and then we had to go home and learn another fact that was in contradiction to that fact, and it was about the 4th of July, right? You know what I mean? So it was just like, right. So yeah, I've struggled mightily with scholars in public around like either we've always had disinformation and like why the interest now, or all of this is like wrong. So it's either always been the case or it's all wrong. I don't know which one it is, but it's weird.
Yeah, and I think obviously we're talking and thinking about the fun new blue check that that's going to make thinking about misinformation, and I can never remember which one's the malicious one, mis or dis information.
It depends on, you know, self-constructed terms, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I think
one's intentional and the other one isn't.
Well, yes, I guess in crude ways, I think that's true. But again, when we start moving into subcultures and, you know, it gets complicated quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I was only thinking about this because I wrote this article a few years ago about medical misinformation or disinformation, I can't remember which one, especially in the wake of COVID and the way that it was going through WhatsApp chats, which was, you know, such a beautiful time. Me spending, you know, hours a week just sort of begging family members to please use the Snopes website or whatever, which is obviously a lost cause. Don't know why I even bothered. But, you know, like that was a really interesting moment thinking about like the platform's response to that and like how, but, you know, all this to say that when I was thinking about the nature of mis versus disinformation, I guess the way that I would frame it is like the person who starts the text chain that says, oh, you know, we found this out from this university student at this university, you know, and she says, and and then it morphs and it grows, and even the spread of it itself, it takes on this sort of ritual form where you've got all of these different sort of holistic ways of dealing with illness, and that comes from a very like sensible and rooted place. Like Black distrust of medical institutions is common sense to a certain degree, right? And then it turns into something else. But even just the way that I think that's what makes this so interesting, the way that the platform sort of almost aids and abets that kind of movement, the same way that Twitter is just such a fertile ground for that to happen, because it's so easy to do this. And obviously oh god, I've already forgotten her name. The example of the Russian bot.
Oh, Crystal.
There we go. Like, she did not have a blue check but now she could quite easily, like that's all about to get, so I'm really interested in kind of what what the future of this kind of work is going to look like. Like everything we've said today, 6 months down the line could have taken a much more sort of horrifying turn.
Yeah, absolutely. And some things that changed really, are actually just a return to a lot of things that we already knew, right? So I'm thinking through the difference between what is a devoted person and what is a fanatic. It oftentimes comes down to how frequent or the intensity and the repetitions of the ritual, right? And I'm thinking through that in this moment, and it's like, well, Crystal didn't really lie. She, instead of a couple of, 2 people twice a day having a conversation about their hesitation for Hillary Clinton, she talked about Hillary all the time. Not a single lie in there though, but maybe instead of it being a question now it's a distrust, right? Instead of it being a distrust, now it's disdain, right? So it's like, okay, that's not so much the lie, but it's the manipulation of the ritual that's happening there that we don't really, that's real more of a sociological kind of, you're doing something for me.
The drama of that, turning out to be like I think there's so many larger fears being blown up in that moment as well, about the fact that this was in particular, like someone wrote like a possible, like, what was it, 60-year-old KGB agent, which was so evocative in that comment, right? But I'm also thinking about like a lot of the less, some of the more commonly thought of versions of blackfishing, which I've like also written about a bit, like, that sort of, I don't know if anyone remembers emo Black thought. Does anyone remember? Yeah, right. So that is someone who was masquerading as a Black woman for a really long time, turned out to be a Black man, but like, who had been, this was years, they had such a following. And I remember seeing people's responses to it and writing about, and again, this links to your work, Jeff, people talking about very emotional responses to that, the feelings of betrayal, and, the fact that they had performed, they performed it in such a heavy duty way. Like they had, I think, even like gotten some pictures from Black women, and like, were in smaller groups, and there was a lot of like real tricky consent issues, because I think there was a point where there was like a sharing of nudes, that it all got very, very complicated, very unethical. And then maybe a year or two ago, it was revealed, and this is something that comes up again recently. And, so this idea of people being very distrustful of who someone is online versus not isn't just something that happens inter-community, it also happens intra-community. And, again, we also have all these questions about blackfishing when you just have things like Bad Baby, Bad Barbie, who has recently become a Black woman, like very, very recently. And, these are sorts of conversations that are happening in group all the time about those lines and those performances and rituals that are being crossed and taken advantage of at this moment. It's just that in this case, it has such dire political ramifications on like a massive global scale, right? As opposed to it being a sort of in-group curiosity.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about the distinction for both of you between like ritual and habit, and the way that these kind of intra-community unmasking rituals themselves are constitutive of community. Like maybe this is an important dynamic for community rejuvenation and sort of formation. Like it has to happen somehow. These people are actually in a way like necessary to just, I don't know, to mediating the kinds of like conflicted mis and disinformation environment that is social media and is social media subculture and sort of social media counterpublics, and dealing with the kinds of paranoia that Kevin was discussing. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I think a tiny part of that would be just like about the nature of like the movement of the rituals, like the fact that they are self-generative but like also that new ones spring up every day. Like it's more about codifying membership than anything else, but it's not, these rituals like often shift and often new ones come out of nowhere almost. Like, you know, it's like when Twitter has a main character for the day and stuff like that. It's not necessarily, but yeah, and also a fact that some of those rituals shift between online and offline spaces, like some of it is just like the pure patterns and habits and rituals of being Black that are just really easily translatable to online. It's like a chicken and egg situation where it's not necessarily like the ritual itself is like a performance of Black digitality. It's just, yeah, I think there's definitely something in that about like what those rituals purposes are and how like I think a lot of it is about being able to shift to evade, like in a fugitive way, to evade detection, to evade, you know, Blackness is always something, like when I think about like the global ontology of Blackness, is about shift, it's about movement, it's ephemeral and flux, and I think a lot of that just maps out online really neatly.
Yeah, I think through this has me thinking through colleague Sarah Florini's work on like oscillating public networks and how there is already these habits, if you will, of moving from one social platform to another as a way of not getting rid of a gaze, but maybe shifting the gaze a little bit where the folks who were already paying attention to your conversation that may have those cues are now disjointed a little bit. So I can at least have this, it's still having it in a public, but this gaze doesn't know what I'm talking about anymore, right? So, and it's also interesting to think about that in relationship to the network of fake bots that was coming up. They were absolutely trying to replicate that kind of network, right? Get hooked into Crystal. Maybe you follow where she works, and now you're on the fakey, newsy, bloggy, user-generated content site that again is still pumping you with factual information. Technically, right? You can research and find that incident. That's not a fake picture. That was not a fake incident. It's just, I'm upset when I should probably be at home watching like Scandal right now. You know what I mean? Like yeah. Yeah. And also so this difference, this distinction between habits and ritual, and oftentimes, at least in my experience, and this is not the researcher, it's more kind of experiential knowledge here. Within Black movements, oftentimes they pop off when rituals are disturbed, right? So I think about like Ferguson, it wasn't when the trauma happened that it moved into something that looked like protest. It was when the community came together and tried to create a memorial and the police drove through it, right? It was the disruption of ritual that then turned this from a ritual into a process or into a movement, right? If the police don't drive through that, I wholeheartedly believe that we would have not had the attention on that we had, right? And then it being replicated over and over in these different sites, right? So now we can even skip steps in the mourning process. I've already mourned for another thing that was just like this. We're gonna go from shock to action, right? So repetition and process, particularly as we study these things as like movement and counter movement work, is really, really important in ways that I'm still thinking through apparently. So yeah, this is all great.
We are a little bit over time, but maybe as a way to bring it to a close and a way of bridging those last two topics, Rianna, I loved that in your presentation, we got a glimpse of the kinds of rituals that might emerge when the platform ends. That sounded to me almost like funerary rites, you know, like at the very end, we're going to get everything. We're going to get the full review of like all of these community rituals sort of recapitulated in this very abbreviated, almost like keyword, if you want, format. Not that I'm excited for the implosion of Twitter, but at least if it goes out, we'll get this like amazing like recap of years and years of community formation.
Yeah, I can't even avoid it because I've there's something I write about in my work called group chat as method, which is like one of my ways of capturing ephemera when I cannot be everywhere at once and when I have my personal qualms with certain scraping methods and things like that, which means that I have not necessarily solicited people to send me all these threads and DMs and stuff, but my people, whenever someone comes across something that they think is useful for my research, I will receive, like I get just dozens of DMs, people being like, this looks like something you'll care about. And because I made the mistake of making public some of my research about the whole I don't know if anyone remembers the leg washing of 2019, yeah? So I write about that. And it means that over the last like week or so, there have been so many threads where people have gone, what was the craziest moment on Twitter for you? These sort of hyper narrative, like funerary. What's the word for when you have at a funeral? I've forgotten already. See, it's too late now. But like people, when you read a thing at a funeral, what's that word? Eulogies. Thank you. All of these massive eulogy threads, people being like, oh, the craziest thing I learned was about how white people don't wash their legs. And because I wrote that paper about leg washing, I get these same tweets, maybe 10 times a day. And, it's a really interesting thing because I'm trying to figure out the best ways that I can, I'm feeling some real anxiety about it. And I'm sure I'm sure all of us are thinking about how best to archive this moment. I know, like, I've seen lots of people talking about downloading your personal archive on Twitter. I know I've done that. And it's the sheer richness of what, it's not even that I necessarily believe that we will lose Twitter. I'm not getting engaged in those kinds of conversations about where will Black Twitter go? What will we do? I'll just wait and see. I'm going down with the ship personally, but it's still the fact that this moment has ignited this brand new ritual where everyone is being very self-reflexive and very retrospective. And I guess I'm also very interested now that I've moved here from the UK and my timeline is very slowly, mainly just because of time zone things, like slowly getting a little bit more American. I miss out on all the British Twitter stuff because we're asleep. But, even just seeing the difference between the history of Black British Twitter versus, the much bigger history of like African American Twitter. But yeah, like it's a really curious moment. And I don't know, I'm curious, is anyone else thinking about archiving that and thinking about how to present that sort of thing? Like, I know one of the things I talked about a few days ago was tags, the Twitter archive and Google Sheet, but it's not necessarily fit to the purpose that I've got here where I want to capture these sorts of things. Does anyone have any thoughts about how we capture this kind of ephemera? Or where
the Web Time Machine has done a decent job of archiving Twitter. It certainly has its failure points, but I was able to get a lot of Crystal's accounts and through that way, and pretty decent sized engagement with her. Her text you can get that. The images was like 40% of the time it was there. And videos is just, you're not gonna get videos. It's just videos. It's just, they don't do that. But I have thought many a times if they already have the apparatus to do it and it's just about like really failure rate, that maybe we need to have some sort of fundraising campaign to kind of beef up their capabilities, because they're already doing the work, right? So yeah.
I guess for me, this sounds really remarkably collaborative in a way. Like, as someone who works mostly with not living archives, like I don't want to say dead archives, but like old file cabinets abandoned in a hospital, or someone's papers that no one has looked at for 40 years. Like no one is like sending me things that I should go look at. Like archival historians, like they find their archive and then they sort of squat on it, like, and they don't tell anyone about it. And like you don't tell anyone about it until you like publish it. But they're so like kind of paranoid and like covetous of like the material riches that they've found, which is like a handful of dusty photographs and like experimental setups from like 1954. So
I mean, it's back to the whole Black feminist praxis thing I was talking about, and the ethics and that kind of sorry. That's Levi. That comes back to the Black feminist praxis and ethics that I'm working with, thinking about the ways that this work can be collaborative and ways that this work can talk to the community that I want it to talk to, and yeah, especially because, again, I've got that tension between where this work goes and where it came from. So yeah, and also it's just been a lot more fun. Honestly, that's the way that's what kind of led me there from doing that. But yeah, I think it's, again, that notion of the living archive as well. Like, if you are reframing what constitutes an archive and who it belongs to and who builds it, the fact that this is something that is a constant work in progress, and understanding that no one person can do that work on their own is like very core to the fact that it has to be that way. I can't imagine how I would do it otherwise, to be honest. But I'm going to mute Nate so that he can really have his little freak out as he needs to.
Rianna, how you talked about the sharing of archivable material and just what the community kind of deems as something that will be helpful to your work. That's been my experience. My work before this with Black Catholic nuns, after I got through the kind of protection performances that was happening, because they just don't trust museums and the Smithsonian to like come and take, like, once we got past that, right, they was like, oh, are you the cops? And it was like, no, I'm not the cops. And they was like, oh, okay, you're not the cops. Well, here, I got all of this over here for you to see. And it was like, oh no, yeah, this is the official archive, but you don't know about my, my late sister who was also here. And like, it was nonstop. Even the understanding of owning this history, right? Like, they're protecting it because they don't want to be exploited, but they don't define this as ownership in the ways that we talk around, or even, you know what I mean? So that whole thing is like, no, of course you can see it because I trust that you're going to do right by me and my people, right? And it was like, oh, and that certainly lends itself online. Yeah,
that definitely, the in-group participation, in-group, that's absolutely been the core of the Access thing. In fact, one of the funniest comments that I got from my Viva was that one of my examiners said, like, it seems like you're just talking to all of your friends. And I was like,
yes,
I will not apologize for being popular. But also, it was mainly just because, like, honestly, these people became my friends over the process. It didn't have anything to do with, I started this PhD with 200 followers and I've ended it with significantly more. That's like, a process of embedding myself into the community that I'm talking about to build those networks of trust. Like, the kind of research that we're doing has to be this kind of reflexive, and it has to be different. If we're hoping for academia to look a bit different, then we have to organize ourselves differently and orient ourselves to it differently. There can't be this artificial separation, like, part of the thing about being one of so few Black scholars in the UK means that who else could do the work the way that I'm doing it? No one else would be able to have the access the way that I have. And that is right and proper, So, that's both a responsibility and also a massive opportunity.
Juan, I guess for you, like, something in your talk that I was thinking about is that you're also kind of working with the legacy of a population that didn't leave like themselves physical archives. Like, they were basically, their archives were suppressed. And so your practice I think at least what I got from like maybe your last two slides, a glimpse of, is to look at sort of aesthetic reimaginations of what those archives might have been, that kind of like re-embody them or reimagine them or reinstantiate them in a way that is a kind of like speculative archive, you know? And so I was curious, maybe if you want to say a word or two about that. I'm in a similar position to some degree where like a lot of the people who went into the creation of emotion metrics and emotion AI systems are also like silent in a way that's kind of non-negotiably, they're not super recoupable depending on the era. And so I've struggled a little bit with trying to figure out how to give them some kind of voice. And so I'd be curious, yeah, to hear about your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, in terms of the histories that I'm really thinking about, the racial histories that I'm thinking about, I'm really interested in the way that artistic practice and literature can kind of reorient our approach to thinking about what we mean when we construct a racial history of the digital, and not necessarily to, for example, think about race in the level of kind of individual identity or simply include, racial workers. So all of the kind of artists and writers who I look at very much operate in kind of a non-representational mode. So the reason I think you mentioned the last few slides, I was really interested in Zlin's work as the kind of critical reorientation to different questions about how we might think about race when it's kind of unmarked and not necessarily tied to like an individual body. So when you kind of think about race not as identity and think about how it's formulated through various historical structures such as settler colonialism, that's kind of my kind of longer interpretation of that artwork is that it's doing this work of foregrounding the land itself. So what happens when we think about racial histories of the digital outside of, just individual racial actors, but thinking about when race is unmarked from the individual, racial logics are revealed in a certain way. So I think that's why I'm really interested as kind of a literary and cultural studies scholar of like turning to literature and art, specifically when they are produced by, like Asian American artists and writers, but aren't necessarily in any kind of legible way like Asian American. And what kind of happens, what kind of other orientations do we have towards, history, towards the way in which we think about race when we're not necessarily kind of tied to these racial markers.
Lisa, we are approaching 6. I wondered if you had any final word for this.
Not at all. I think these were wonderful talks, and all the ideas for how to do things with them are great. So I'm really looking forward to the next set, and thank you all. This was wonderful and exactly what we were hoping to create when we brought this group together.
Thank you, everyone who stuck around with us to the end, and keep an eye out for the next installment of this series, which hopefully we'll pin down a date for and let you all know about quite soon. Yeah, and thank you to my wonderful co-panelists, and have a great night.